From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And ahead today, K-State's Ignacio Ciampitti will take up two current row crop issues in Kansas, rootless corn stands. As a result of wet fields, he'll talk about whether that poor rooted corn has a chance to recover and be at least somewhat productive. And he'll look at soybean planting delays and recommended adjustments that you might consider producers with your late planted beans. Then from the Kansas Forest Service at K-State, Mark Neely talks about the new state funding for wildfire response and mitigation in Kansas. This is a major step forward in wildfire suppression and control, and Mark will tell us why. Further ahead with Stop, Look, and Listen, K-State's Gus Vander Hoeven, along with more, here on Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. This is Agriculture Today. Once again, good to have you aboard. Well, the planting season in Kansas still has its trials and tribulations. Many producers now looking at late planting of soybeans following the great delays in corn planting we're all well familiar with. Our guest, Ignacio Ciampitti, crop production and cropping systems specialist with K-State Research and Extension, who can identify with you producers. He's been mightily struggling with his crew to get the test plots in that they really would like to get done here before too long, and we hope you'll have some luck with that, Ignacio. Two things today. One, because of overly wet soils, there have been corn stands out there that have not developed roots hardly to the normal level, and that is causing problems.
Yeah, I mean, as always, Eric, thanks for the invitation. And this is one of the moments that also, if we have a chance, we can start looking at that corn that got planted maybe a few weeks ago. Some of that corn might not look exactly as we expected. In fact, I mean, some of the corn stands that I was looking around the area, central Kansas and eastern Kansas, we're starting to look that this growing degree estimation, I mean, is not really playing that well this year. So whatever was supposed to be B5, B6, or B7, usually it's one or two stages a little bit delayed, which I think that is related to temperature conditions during the night, that they have been fairly low in some situations, and also add to the combo the stress, which is the water stress. In this case, for excess of water, right, not for the field. Right. So the opposite stress that we usually tend to have. Right. So if you combine all these situations, and if you also add into the combo planting conditions not optimal, and we push in many fields planting conditions not at the optimal level, so wet or saturated soils are really just the perfect combination for compaction. So a lot of sidewalk compaction, and then is when we start inspecting some of the cornfields that some of the roots, specifically secondary roots developing B4, B6, are not really developing that well, and sometimes are just restricted to the first few inches. Which is telling us basically that those saturated soils were holding water for many days, impeding, those roots to grow and move faster, deeper in the profile, and then we are finishing with some of the initial roots, size that they are very small compared to the upper section of the plant.
You're actually referring to this as rootless corn syndrome.
Yeah, in fact, floppy or rootless corn and then syndrome. Few things that you might start seeing is plants that they might be looking upright until any movement or wind, those plants will start presenting some lodging, and this is specifically because the roots were not really properly developed. So sometimes we don't have almost not even roots. So this is a big challenge. Even when those roots were developed, in most situations were developed because they face a compaction. So, and then any time that there was the soil compacted in any situation, or even in the case as mentioned before, water standing in the field. So the root growth is limited. The oxygen and respiration that the roots need to do, all that oxygen is also limited on the water. So, and then we are finishing with problems that they are not only connected to lack of root development and also basically lack of that plant to be anchored to the soil, but also will be impacting in the future water. You will start seeing symptoms of drought even really early in the season, even when maybe not even under really severe drought conditions, maybe with just 1 week without rain. And if the roots are not really properly developed, most likely we will start seeing drought issues. Nutrient deficiencies. Remember that the roots are the primary organ for, not only water intake, but also nutrient access. So we will start seeing multiple issues on this.
Is there any chance that these corn stands that are so poorly developed in their root systems can recover at all, can set secondary roots, and actually become a semi-viable crop?
One of the things, we did a few studies, a couple of years on specifically to looking at these problems on floppy. We call it, basically rootless of floppy. And depending on the conditions, you might see some situations that maybe some plants, if you do a cultivation, if you move the soil, might help, to develop some roots. But the challenge is that if we don't do it very soon, the plant is investing in the early stages more resources into root development. And then when the plant is growing, those resources are being invested into the upper section. So, which means, translation, that if we don't do it sooner than later, we'll have the problem that plant will probably not produce very good root systems.
So producers, if they're seeing these conditions, floppy corn or rootless corn, if you rather, out there, they're potentially going to make or have to make some hard decisions on whether or not to carry on with that stand, Ignacio.
Yeah, and I think that the situation will be more connected to the growing conditions on the next coming weeks. Mm-hmm. If we still continue with this rapid cycling of saturated soils and drying soils, saturated soils, and then drying conditions, that is not helping much for the root development process. We really need to have a few days of more drying down conditions so, that plant can improve that root growth, development. Farmers can go out and take a look to a few plants. Go out and start looking at digging some of the plants. You don't need to dig that much. Just by looking at the first section of the roots, you will identify if they are really properly developed or not.
If a producer would like a better idea of what this condition looks like, you have color photography in the Agronomy E-Update newsletter on diagnosing rootless corn syndrome, and that's at agronomy.ksu.edu. The other thing we wanted to address today, Ignacio, corn planting has fairly well come and gone at this point, and we're getting close to that situation in soybeans as well, although there is some opportunity yet to plant soybeans late and successfully, you say.
Yeah, based on our research, I think that it's still impressed. Soybean has this ability to compensate, and one of the interesting facts, that we were looking at the data from the last more than 20 years. In fact, I think that we start from 1980s looking at the data. And then the only year that we were extremely delayed, and we basically reached 50% of planting soybeans at the state level was in 1982. Mm-hmm. So my hope is that we will not get there because that will be quite extreme. And then if conditions are good for doing this week, my guess is that we will be in maybe close to 40 or 50% by next week. We will be planting a lot of soybeans, in the next coming days. Still, the situation, when you're looking at our research, if you want to say some of the main tips about planting delays, planting soybeans and row spacing, start looking at possibilities of narrowing your canopies, looking at 15 inches. And this is helping the plants many times to close the canopy faster and compensate for the lack of days. Planting dates, most of the times we tested planting days even going until the end of June. And in many situations, we were able still too much, not to go to the really, really highest yield, but our data research shows in very good environment yields from 50, 60 bushels on late June planting.
That's acceptable then?
I think so. Even based on the conditions that comparing different planting dates. Maturity groups, if you don't go to the far extreme, I think that is cutting the maturity groups is not always a good idea. I will try to keep similar maturity groups with the goal of trying to make more canopy. The only situation is if you're already in a maturity group that is too long, the only concern is just to make sure that you can finish the crop before a freeze is coming. So maturity groups, if you are in an area that basically is around 3 or 3.5, I mean, if you are on 3 or 3.5, you will be in the right spot until at least at the end of June, so with no problem. If you're looking about seeing rates, we usually say if you are going late or if you are going to an environment that seems to be lower performing, I think that seeing rates increase on 10-20% can help to basically promote this fast competition between plants and help those plants to close a canopy and intercept more light. Anytime that you can intercept more light means more yields if the other factors are not limiting. So light is always good. So remember these tips on basically narrowing rows, on row spacing, keeping potentially the same maturities if you are not too long in maturity groups, looking at possibility to plant in the best soil conditions. So we have information that even until late June, yields are not truly impacted unless you are in a really high yielding environment, maybe 80, 70 bushels. So you will see some impact on losing yield potential. But if you are in environments 50 bushels or 60 bushels, I think that we will be seeing no much loss, on yield on those areas. And then on the seeing rate, just as a reminder, if you are going way too late, we are talking about the end of June, I think that just push a little bit more and 10-20% based on your typical seeing rate. If you're already on the highest end, I would say don't go too much. Mm-hmm. When I'm saying highest end, is usually any ones that are working in 140,000, 150,000, they're already too high. 100,000 or less, so make sure that you just work on those numbers and trying to get 10-20% more to make sure that you compensate and have a good canopy.
And there is an article likewise on this topic in the latest Agronomy E-Update newsletter dated last Friday, May the 31st, on late planting of soybeans, the management considerations. Have a look at that as well at agronomy.ksu.edu. Well, Ignacio, back to the field you go, and we appreciate you taking a few moments to visit with us about these matters at hand, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks for the invitation.
Ignacio Ciampitti, Crop Production and Cropping Systems Specialist with K-State Research and Extension, and Agriculture Today will continue in a few moments on the K-State Radio Network. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and welcome back. Follow up now on a development out of the Kansas Legislature 2019 in support of improving our wildfire mitigation and response efforts here in the state of Kansas. And this is being channeled through the Kansas Forest Service here at Kansas State University. Across the way now is the State Fire Management Officer with the Forest Service, Mark Neely, our first chance to visit with him. So welcome to you, Mark, first of all.
Thank you.
Tell us more about what has developed here. The legislature has approved the Kansas Forest Service and its fire management program to, if you will, ramp up education in wildfire response and controlling wildfires, correct?
That's correct. So in the first time in our history, we have a line item from the Kansas legislature to fund wildfire suppression efforts. And that comes into the form of training, education, like you mentioned, but for the training for volunteer fire departments across the state, also for communities to better prepare themselves for making their communities more resilient towards wildfires, and also the promotion of prescribed fire across the state. That prescribed fire is a tool that we need to continually promote because that is a hazard fuels reduction for us also, which just means we're reducing the amount of grass out there, and that reduces the amount of energy for wildfires also.
Before we get into the particulars of this financial support, this effort long in the making, hasn't it?
It has. Yeah, so it really started in 2016 with the Anderson Creek fire. And there was an article published in the Wichita Eagle, and that kind of got the ball rolling. And then 2017 was the Starbuck fire. So we had 2 record-breaking years of wildfires in Kansas, and that led to a legislative post-audit, which was a research into how other states respond to wildfires once it gets to the state level of assistance, not at the local level, at the state level. And then that resulted in many committee hearings and the culmination of this line item now for additional funding to help locals better prepare and be trained for wildfires.
Since you brought it up, what did that audit tell legislators and other interested parties about our ability to respond?
Well, it's kind of a convoluted system. There's multiple agencies involved in the response. It's between Kansas Forest Service, the Office of State Fire Marshal, and Kansas Division of Emergency Management. And together those 3 make a response where in other states that was looked at, particularly plain states, Oklahoma, Texas, North Dakota, like states like we are, to see how they were running things. And it fell to one agency to kind of coordinate those efforts, because it's not just a emergency response. There's a lot that goes in prior to there's an emergency, like I mentioned, the training or community resilience. And so it found that those agencies many times fell within a forestry service or a natural resource agency. And they were greatly funded to the point of we were dollars on the acre where they were 44 and 88, I think. I'd have to check those numbers, but it was a drastic change in how much funding was given towards Kansas fire suppression efforts compared to Oklahoma and North Dakota.
And so the state legislature, having seen this information, took heed and is wanting to amp up what's going on here in the state of Kansas, which includes this recent appropriation to your department.
That's correct. And so after that audit, which was published last June 28th of 2018, that's when then legislators took note of it and started having some informational hearings, committee hearings, and that lasted all through this past March with the legislative session. And there's a lot of good discussion, a lot of good foresight from the legislation to move forward on this thing, and it's greatly appreciated by us and hopefully eventually greatly appreciated by all the local fire authorities also.
And we want to talk about how that appreciation will manifest itself. It's a $650,000 appropriation in fiscal year 2020's budget, which has been signed into law now, on 2 fronts, and one is, in fact, supporting those volunteer fire departments around the state of Kansas with additional training. How do you, Mark, envision that coming together?
Well, we're looking at some field personnel that would be located throughout the state. For instance, right now, it would take us 6 hours sometimes of driving to do a hour worth of training. Volunteers across the state are what they are. They're volunteers. They have most time a weeknight training session that may be 2 hours. Well, we need to meet those volunteers on their terms and their turf. So by putting field personnel throughout the state, we can meet those needs of being at such local volunteer fire departments training night without the 6 hours of travel, hotel rooms, and costs that are associated with that. So we can put them there. They can have their training right where they need it, what they need it, more frequently. And then we can build those relationships too, since that person will only be within an hour, hour and a half of most local fire departments. How it's set up right now, their locations, we could be anywhere within the state within 2 hours. And so that means we can have greater coordination, working relationships with the fire chiefs, the firefighters themselves, county commissioners, local municipalities, that we can better prepare them also. And so that's our biggest push, is getting people out into the field. And instead of, like right now, we're just located here in Manhattan, and then we have one personnel in Hutchinson, and just recently, as of last summer, we did hire a gentleman. He's down in Garden City. And so we're able to reach into that pocket. Right now, our next push would be into the Northwest and then South Central. That's where we have our largest majority of our fire issues, and that's where a lot of the fire departments are most spread out to. Eventually, we'd like to see a little bit pushed down in the Southeast, but those are future outgoing years right now.
But the ball is rolling in that direction right now.
We hope so.
And the other side of this, which will be interesting specifically to those who reside in rural areas, there will be public information initiatives to help folks protect their property on their own from the outbreak of a wildfire.
That's right. So some of those duties for those district fire management officers, the folks that are in the field, will be working with landowners and communities themselves, not just the volunteer fire departments, but talking to landowners how they can better prepare their property for an oncoming wildfire, vegetation removal, having a defensible space between their home and vegetation, even some landscaping techniques that can just better prepare their house for an oncoming wildfire. And same principles apply to communities themselves, just at a larger scale. One such project right now is north of Hutch, where the Highlands fire were 2 years ago. We're working through some of the neighborhoods there, reducing the amount of trees that are close to the houses or vegetation, or even just telling them, hey, if there is a fire coming, what you can do with your lawn furniture. Because most fires aren't started in a home from the direct fire impingement. It's embers from the fire. So if we can reduce those combustible materials around their house or in their gutters or on their decks, it can really prevent their houses from starting up also. So those are some of those initiatives that we'll do. We'll just be getting out to the communities, to the landowners, property owners, and along with those property owners is that promotion of prescribed fire also. And keep fire on the ground in Kansas. It's a huge tool, and many people use it, and we just need to continue to promote that and protect that right for us.
And as far as that public outreach, that will be something that the community can approach Kansas Forest Service about having such training. This can be a two-way street then.
Yes, absolutely. So a community can come to us. We can set up open house nights for the community where citizens can come in, get their questions answered. If we progress down this road, this money also then allows us to match federal grant dollars where previously we couldn't get these grant dollars because we had no dollars to match. And so if a community wants to pursue and get some financial assistance, we now have match dollars that we can help them get to that.
One last point of clarification, Mark, and that is about wildfire response coordination. There are still things to be fleshed out there. Multiple agencies are involved in the leadership in that, right?
That's correct. And this line item hasn't changed that. It's still an effort between the offices, the State Fire Marshal, the Kansas Division of Emergency Management, and the Kansas Forest Service. We work together once these fires come to make sure the resources are there for the local fire authorities once they start requesting additional resources. In the past few years, we've learned some lessons and we've worked out some good solutions, and we continually hope to go down that path that we can provide that good, efficient service to the local fire authorities, property owners, to get them the stuff that they need when they're in the need of those fire resources.
Very well. Well, in as far as contacting you or your associates to pursue further these educational and informational trainings, how might they best do so?
Well, they can contact me direct at Kansas Forest Service. They can get online at kansasforest.org. We have all our contact information there. Contact me via email or Facebook page, Twitter. That usually gets passed on to me in some form or another.
Very good. kansasforests.org is a great place to start there.
Yep.
Congratulations to you and all involved in the fire management team at the Kansas Forest Service for this new opportunity. And we're looking forward to talking about it more in the future, Bart.
Yep. I'm glad to be here, and I think it's a very good thing, and I appreciate getting the word out.
And appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Mark Neely with us. He is the State Fire Management Officer with the Kansas Forest Service. Again, that service, which is based here at Kansas State University, receiving the first ever state funding for wildfire response and mitigation. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and we'll be back after this over the K-State Radio Network.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Welcome back. Eric Atkinson here. And now today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, that $19 billion disaster aid plan has now been passed by Congress. It does contain specific portions that address agriculture. The bill provides just over $3 billion to producers whose crops and livestock were destroyed by the storms and the flooding. Most of the farmer disaster aid will be administered through the Wildfires and Hurricanes Indemnity Program. That was used in response to the 2017 hurricane losses. However, the bill includes some important enhancements to that program. Although murky at this time, the language does include assistance for prevented planted acres. Farmers and ranchers would get $558 million for conservation programs to rehabilitate damaged farmlands, while $480 million would go toward forest restoration efforts. And the legislation also allows producers making more than $900,000 per year in adjusted gross income to receive trade aid payments from the USDA if 75% of their income comes from farming, ranching, or forestry. Now, yesterday, the USDA Secretary spoke on the disaster relief measure and the process in implementing assistance to states impacted by those natural disasters. Here's more from the USDA's Rod Bain.
A Tuesday visit to North Carolina for Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue, among those celebrating passage of the Congressional Disaster Relief Package in the House of Representatives the night before.
Thankfully, finally, 8 months after Hurricane Florence, we've got a disaster bill that will help the producers, both the cropping and the livestock producers there that lost a lot of things. Some people lost everything.
Producers and communities impacted by various hurricanes, wildfires, and flooding, in some cases incidents going back to 2017, will receive aid via this package. The Secretary told reporters in Raleigh that after the bill is signed into law, USDA and states will be working closely in implementing this relief, such as in the Tar Heel State.
We look forward to implementing that in a fair way, and we'll be taking applications, working with Commissioner Troxel here in North Carolina, helping them and them helping us identify where the real damage and where the losses are so we can do that in a fine fashion.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Responding to a request from the Agricultural Retailers Association, a USDA spokesperson says that the department cannot change crop insurance contracts to extend the planting season. The Agricultural Retailers Association wants USDA Secretary Perdue to extend the late planting season for crop insurance to avoid the risk of unintended consequences from the disaster legislation that passed Congress. Final planting dates and the late planting period are part of a binding insurance contract between the producer and their insurance company, says the spokesperson. As such, they cannot be waived or altered during the insurance period. The Ag Retailers Group fears its members will be left holding seed treatments, fertilizer, and other chemicals if farmers don't plant a crop. The disaster package includes language on prevented planted insurance that could boost the prevent planting insurance coverage up to 90% of the loss for those who bought policies. That bill also has language that would allow producers who did not obtain an insurance policy under the non-insured crop disaster assistance program to pay a fee and then cover up to 70% of prevented planting losses. Based on the late season, analysts already are predicting a potential record year for prevented planting claims and acreage, even before that disaster aid was approved. Now, crop insurance coverage does decline 1% each day after the final planting date for the next 20 to 25 days afterwards in most states. Farmers were already facing some pressure to plant because the USDA did announce last month the new trade aid payment being based on planted acres, but the weather has not cooperated with the planting season thus far. Today's beef consumer increasingly turns to social media for information about human nutrition and cattle production practices. Todd Domer tells us here that a group of influential dietitians recently was given some hands-on experience in hopes of helping them accurately tell the beef story online.
Beef councils from Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and Oklahoma hosted a select group of 25 registered dietitians during late May for a checkoff-funded event emphasizing beef's nutritional profile, culinary versatility, and production methods. Attendees of Nutrition Adventure were selected for their high levels of involvement on social media and blogs, giving them the ability to influence thousands of consumers. The group learned more from registered dietitian Jill Castle about beef nutrition as it applies to raising healthy children from infancy through adolescence. The dietitians were challenged to utilize trendy ingredients to maximize the flavor and eating experience of beef dishes in a hands-on cooking activity. The group also took part in an interactive session on food photography and styling that was designed to help them showcase beef recipes on their social media platforms and blogs. The high point for many participants was a tour of the Tailgate Ranch near Tonganoxie. Dietitians had the opportunity to ask questions of area beef producers in attendance and hear from a panel composed of cow-calf producer Kirk Sowers, K-State veterinarian Dan Thompson, feed yard operator Jack Klosterman, and Wes Craig with Cargill Meat Solutions. Questions asked covered the topics of animal handling practices, antibiotic use, growth promotants, and sustainability factors. State Beef Councils host events like Nutrition Adventure to give opinion influencers accurate first-hand knowledge that can be conveyed to the large consumer audiences they reach through social media. I'm Todd Domer.
And farms are now exempt from reporting air emissions from animal waste after the EPA finalized yesterday a new rule amending the Emergency Release Notification regulations under the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, or EPCRA. Back in April of 2017, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit struck down a 2008 EPA ruling that exempted large animal feeding operations from reporting air pollutants generated by animal waste. Back in 2008, the Bush administration exempted animal feeding operations from having to report ammonia and hydrogen sulfide emissions in particular. At the time, the agency estimated that rule would save farms more than 1 million hours, more than $60 million in compliance costs, and eliminate about 160,000 hours and $8 million in government costs over 10 years. Now, that action prompted a number of environmental groups to sue the EPA. The agency's action yesterday drew praise from a number of agricultural groups that had been fighting for another exemption. Last year, President Trump signed into law an act that exempted air emission reporting from animal waste. That's a glance at today's agricultural news headlines. Gus van der Hoeven is in for his weekly feature next on Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
When I look at the grassy hill behind the house through the leafy branches, I am tempted to start opening up.
That's Gus van der Hoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
I've never met Daniel Boone. For that matter, I never met Davy Crockett. Daniel Boone died peacefully at his home on September 26, 1820. Davy Crockett was born in 1786 and died in 1836, not so peacefully. Daniel Boone was already 52 years old when little Dave was born. I've seen a few of the movies and read books. It's Daniel Boone I'm interested in and who got me thinking. Daniel Boone put Kentucky on the map. If I'm correct, he was born in Pennsylvania. He was a pioneer. He grew up in the wooded East and explored it. As a woodsman, he must have loved trees, and I'm sure he must have seen magnificent trees men will never see again, all harvested now. But as much as he must have been in awe with big trees, he must have loved the clearing, natural clearings he came across while exploring. The clearing may have been caused by lightning strikes or men setting fires running out of control. Whatever the case, the clearings where a man could step out in the open and look around him, and all he would see is trees and understory brush. Unless he stood on a bald mountaintop, and all he saw was more mountaintops, wooded or not wooded, all in a bluish haze. I left that country on the Virginia and West North Carolina side. I've ridden a good mule over overgrown coach trails no longer used, except by some of the locals. Trees everywhere. Sometimes you hear the gurgling of a spring. If it rains, the branches drip. It's a different country. But I want to come back to the clearings. It was at the clearings that a man could quickly establish himself and his family. There was pasture for the milk cows to graze, and a broken plot could grow corn. Remember, we're talking early times. But thinking about it, I realized that moving into Kansas and passing the eastern, more wooded part, settlers became unsettled on the wide open plains with no trees to speak of. And I realized I am a classic example in modern times. What confronted me with the issue was when I read the booklet, which is given out with the yearly celebration of the Flint Hills, with the symphony in the Flint Hills, of which I've attended a few. Each year the location is chosen carefully, and it represents the beauty of these Flint Hills, the tall grass prairie. It dawned on me that as much as I love the Flint Hills, I have been part of its demise. Don't get me wrong, we burn the rangeland. But where I live, I have planted trees. I've planted many trees. When planning to build on the farm, I planted a windbreak. I planted trees along the curving creek, trying to stabilize the banks. It doesn't help much, and I have my questions. A forester even suggested I open up the hay meadow. I cannot get at because the creek caused the access road to cave. To plant trees. A first reaction was, planting trees is a solution. It might even be subsidized, but it is wrong. Wrong, wrong. All this is or should be open land, grassland. Yes, I have corners where trees grow. I've even planted walnut trees where the land was wet and I couldn't get to harvest hay during wet weather. I have springs coming out of a steep wooded hillside. I will never do it, but I know if I cut and remove all the trees, the springs would roar. I recognize it in the present situation, and so did the mighty engineer the beaver. It intrigued me to see in myself where I went wrong. But I grew up with trees all around me. I surely had trees around me when I lived in North Carolina and in Virginia. My younger daughter, who asked for some landscaping advice for their home near Salina, made it very clear. Whatever you suggest, Papa, remember, we don't want to lose our view over the hills and toward the beautiful sunsets we can see. Now that is a true Kansan, or should I say Westerner. As I've worked the state, you notice that where people live, they mostly have created the enclosed home where trees provide shelter. There are exceptions where people build on top of hills, with vistas in all directions. And the way we can build homes now with ample insulation and good design, we can place the house on open locations where the sky is the limit. If I had built on the farm, I would not have planted many more trees than I had for the solid windbreak. Looking where we live, I did planted many beautiful trees beside a good windbreak. I look at myself and I wonder, would I have done things differently now after living here on the hill for 43 plus years. When I look at the grassy hill behind the house through the leafy branches, I am tempted to start opening up, to cut some of those branches. But you know, the grassy hill is a clearing. The opening is surrounded by trees. It is a clearing. The trouble is, the first winter we lived here, there was thick frost on the hinges of the door to the outside on the north side of the house. I remember why I thought I needed a windbreak. We do not need for privacy. We need it for the cold wind.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. With that, our Wednesday edition comes to a close. We'll be right back here this same time tomorrow and hope you'll rejoin us then. Meantime, Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.